Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to another Tuesday talk show. So, just as a bit of another thing here, I wanted to go on the other side of my D&D experiences and talk a little bit about my time as the DM. Now, I figured maybe I could talk a little bit about my first time DMing, but honestly, I don't remember which game for sure was the first time I DM'd. I remember every game I ran, but I'm pretty sure I remember which one was the first one, but I'm not actually 100% sure which order they all came in. But what I actually want to talk about instead was something far more interesting, and that is the first time I managed to kill a player character off as a DM. Now, there's a couple different takes that I could do for this, because there's sort of two different situations that you could consider the first. So one time, was unambiguously like I had an NPC and that NPC managed to kill off one of the players. The other time was a time where I put the player character in such a terrible situation that the player opted to have the character off themselves before they could actually get killed by the really bad situation. So we'll be going through both of those stories just for now. Chronologically, the one I'm going to be going through first is the one that actually happened more recently. It's the one that I definitely feel is the more definitive I killed the player character sort of moment there. Sorry, excuse me. So anyway, let's just do some background for the story and the world sort of at large here. So this is one of the more recent ones. It's not the most recent campaign that I ever ran, but it is a more recent one. And the sort of setup for this world was that they were on this isolated planet. And when I say isolated, I mean in the sense that normally D&D, all of the different planets are connected by a network of planes to one another. And the campaign settings exist as these sort of entities within the material realm that are connected through the phlogiston in a crystal sphere sort of setting, like in the way that those crazy flat earthers believe the celestial sphere is dotted with these little weird things up in the sky. They basically take that and just get rid of the Earth. So there's no flat Earth, but there is the rest of it. So that's essentially what Spelljammer's based around, which is what my D&D, my main DM uses for his campaign. And I draw heavily from that campaign. I basically am like writing fan fictions of my DM's work there, because that's the sort of person I am, I guess. But in any event, what I did in this particular one was I just essentially had one of them, which used to be part of a larger empire, the one that I was working on, be disconnected for a variety of reasons in the story from the rest of the planes, from the other crystal spheres. So you couldn't actually get from this planet to anywhere else. It was essentially in sort of a lockdown. And one of the other things about the D&D sort of cosmology is that magic seeps in and out of the planes and doesn't really exist on the material on its own necessarily. So what was happening in this particular planet was that players were limited in how they use spells. Essentially, you could recollect the magic that would normally have seeped from the material plane after you cast a spell back into the astral plane. Since it couldn't go back to the astral plane, it just sat there, essentially, meaning that you could go and basically just pick it back up again and recycle the same sort of magic over and over and over again. In tremendous and ridiculous violation, of course, of Newton's second law of thermodynamics. I think it's the second law of thermodynamics. But in any event, essentially they could sort of harness this to sort of keep themselves alive, because the planet had no sun, no stars, and like most of the entire planet was an ice ball. It was essentially a completely uninhabitable ice ball. The reason that they were alive in their little section of it was because they were in this deep sort of volcanic caldera, which was extremely geothermically active, which meant that it was hot enough for them to sort of stay there. And they sort of had these spells that they were recycling every day that sort of created this artificial sun. Each one was sort of large enough to encompass a small city and the sort of surrounding farmland and so on and so forth. So this was the setting that I had put my players in. And the thing that they were at the start of it was a series of adventurers. That was essentially the vocation. Their job was to delve into dungeons and try and find magic, because the old civilization that had been left behind, their buildings and their cities had crumbled sort of into dust and sort of into ruin and were quite dangerous to get into. So there would be groups of people who would sort of excavate and dig their way into it, but once they'd sort of gotten a sort of hold into it, it would be the job of other people to sort of actually dive into the place and fight the monsters and sort of other things, a lot of which were constructs like security robots and stuff like that from the ancient civilization. Some of it was like slimes that had gotten loose or had sort of seeped in and sort of reproduced in the cracks there, or just large rats and stuff like that. Lots of those sorts of things. So their job was primarily to look for like old magic that they could bring back up, or old magic items that they could sort of harvest for the magic and so on and so forth, because it was what people needed to survive, really. magic was what they used for their sunlight and so on and so forth to sort of keep them sustained, and it was such an important currency for them because, that's what everything used to run on before the collapse of the society. The other thing, of course, that they were doing was stealing things that were just of monetary value inherently. So if they found like a big gold platter or something like that in one of them, then they would totally steal that. This is actually the campaign where my players managed to find a place where there was a tank that was being possessed by a devil, and I use the word tank loosely in this sort of fictional D&D society. Okay, so if you're ever playing D&D and you get your hand on the Stronghold Builder's Guide, which is the 3.0 book, which has not been translated into 3.5, and your DM is someone who's cool with you using it, just slowly start building up a small iron room, just like, it can be like a 10 by 20 room or something like that, and just make it so it's mobile in some way or another, and, just say that you're using these sort of attributes of your stronghold, and just have that there, and then have that one siege weapon, and then just make it so it can sort of float around and reorient itself. And don't tell your DM that you're building a tank, but what you have in the end result is a tank. So that's what these were. It wasn't a real tank in the sort of sense of anything. It was a Stronghold Builder's Guide one-room fortress that was mobile with an artillery piece on it. So yeah, that's how you do that in D&D if you're ever lucky enough to play 3.5 with the DM who's willing to let you use the Stronghold Builder's Guide. They're actually fairly expensive, but still, it's something you can do. Anyway, so in any event, one of the places that my players went to is this old theater that had been run down for like hundreds and hundreds of years. It had been sort of locked in rubble. And when they eventually broke in there, they found out that it was inhabited entirely by this sort of undead group of performance artists who'd been in there for hundreds of years, doing nothing but rehearsing because they had nothing better to do with their time. Me being the naive sort of optimist that I am, expected the players to just sort of murder their way through them and steal all their stuff. But instead, they just sort of talked it out with them and were totally fine with them being there and didn't steal anything. Which sort of threw the whole sort of point of them being adventurers a little bit out the window. But I guess I'm the sort of only person who by default assumes all my players are going to be amoral psychopaths. One of the players, however, did steal a whole bunch of bottles of wine from the basement cellar of the place. And this led to the sort of only conflict that occurred from this particular sort of outing. And that's because, I don't do this to punish players. I make sure that these encounters are generally speaking survivable. But I find that an encounter that you have on this, there's plenty of DMs out there who are going to have it's that you're wandering down a road or down a forest path or whatever, and you just get jumped by some random thing. And these encounters are generally not that interesting to me. I much prefer ones that sort of call back something that I've already done or people that I've already met or things that we're planning on doing. Anything that sort of more ties back to the characters themselves and their actions. So while I don't do this to punish the players, I do this as a reaction to what's going on, because I think that an encounter that's more interesting is sort of its own reward. But in any event, what ended up happening was the player who stole those bottles of wine, he didn't do anything to deal with the particular person who was dealing with it, the sommelier, who was sort of tending to it, dusting off the bottles, turning them every 25 years or whatever. So what ended up happening was that guy got, since the place was no longer buried under rubble, he took a couple of bottles of the wine that he had there, sold it in the black market or whatever, and hired an assassin to kill off that player character. So this assassin was a level 3 rogue halfling who, if you know anything about D&D, a level 3 rogue halfling can be quite annoying to deal with. But more importantly, they're not really that dangerous necessarily. And the player at this point in time was level 5, I believe. And a level 5 character should have no troubles whatsoever in defeating a lower level character. But this is another part of my DMing philosophy, which I know most people aren't going to adhere to, and which I don't really recommend that people do, is that I always use under CR encounters against my players when I can. So if there's a level 5 party, I generally speaking will use a lower level encounter than them, or at most an equal level encounter to them. And the reason that I prefer it this way is it lets me feel more at ease when I use every single ability at that character's disposal. A lot of DMs are afraid to roll up loot for their characters before the encounter, and don't have the monster sort of use those items in the encounter, whereas I, generally speaking, prefer doing it that way. So if they're going to have a level 3 rogue or something like that attacking the party, I like having them have like nightsticks and alchemist fire and a whole bunch of other little things like thunderstones all available at their disposal so that they can use that in the fight. And this means that if they use them, then the party's not, of course, going to get as much loot out of it potentially. But at the same time, these should be fairly easy fights, and they should be able to clear them out fairly quickly so long as they know what's going on. And if these lower level encounters manage to catch them by surprise, it can make it for a compelling and difficult encounter without it simply being, this monster's got really big numbers, you better watch out. So that's generally my line of thinking there. Of course, for a really stupid monster, I'm perfectly willing to have like a level 5 party deal with a level 6 big dumb hit point sponge sort of monster, because those things just sort of walk up and use attack rolls against the party because they're too stupid to use really advanced strategies. Like, I won't use advanced strategies with more stupid encounters, but generally I like to pull up all the stops for the lower level ones, and I prefer using that type of encounter. So anyway, my one player survives the sneak attack from this little level 3 assassin. Note, level 3 rogue, not the actual class assassin, but their job is an assassin. And so a fight breaks out in the streets, essentially. And this level 3 rogue, realizing that, made a terrible mistake, am horribly outmatched, quickly tries to run away and has lots and lots of tools at her disposal to try and get away from this character. So eventually they sort of end up getting past each other, and the halfling rogue's able to go back and recover, actually, the player character's backpack, which is full of the stolen wine. And so this chase continues throughout the streets with the player character trying to figure out where this person went, gathering information, making skill checks and rolls, trying to figure out where this stupid halfling could have gone with his bag full of treasure. And eventually he sort of tracks down where it is. And he sort of sees like the halfling running in one direction and the backpack in another direction. And he opts to go for the treasure, which is, in my opinion, probably the smarter move. And at this point in time, the backpack, it had been like a long time since he had sort of lost sight of the halfling at that point in time. It had been rolling sort of gather information checks for quite a while by then. So he goes there and finds out that it's missing a couple bottles. He can tell just by looking at it that's missing a little bit of the stuff they had in it before. And when he picks it up and opens it, he finds out that there's a needle in there, a needle trap, which is dosed with black lotus venom. And fortunately for the player, he survives at this point in time. But yeah, it was a bit dicey. Black Lotus Venom, or I can't actually remember the name. I know Black Lotus is like a Magic the Gathering thing, but I can't remember if that's also the name of the particularly nasty poison in D&D. I'm pretty sure it is. So anyway, he manages to pass his fortitude saves, and this poison could have easily killed him. It's a very, very powerful poison. But he's lucky he passes both his saves and manages to survive. So at this point in time, he could call it quits. He could be like, okay, it's obviously not worth continuing to hunt this person down. But he also knows that they'll continue trying to sort of complete their contract and finish him off. So he continues going along and finds out that the sort of halfling had eventually hit off in the red light sort of district of the place and is just sort of laying low. And so he's sort of going from place to place down there, trying to fit in, trying to look inconspicuous while trying to get information. So he sits down at a bar on one and fails a couple skill checks and skill rolls. And what he doesn't realize is that the bartender is actually the assassin in disguise in one of them. And so he's drinking his beer, drinking another beer, and eventually he drinks a poisoned one in one of these other places. And at this point, he gets knocked unconscious and sort of just offed. At this point in time, since I didn't really go into too much detail since he was unconscious during the point. If I recall correctly, he drank a dose of oil of Tiggets, is the poison that he went for there. So yeah, that was the first ever time where I had actually killed off a player character, and it was fully, I was the one responsible for that happening, in the sense of like, it was me actually, my NPC that was doing that. Now, were there things that he could have done to survive it? Absolutely. There's always a chance to survive that sort of thing as a player character. And in this particular case, like, the one thing that I think really hurt him in the sense was that he went it alone, that player. So I think that to a certain degree, this was a bit my fault. I should have made it more clear that he should have brought the rest of the party with him to help him out with this, try and watch his back or to make sure that things are going smoothly. But In this particular case, he decided to run off by himself, and this happens in D&D campaigns, where it turns into a bit of a solo session for an hour or two. And it happens often, but I try to avoid it where possible. I didn't manage to avoid it properly here. So yeah, it ended up ending poorly for him. And yeah, that ends up being the story of the first time I had ever killed a player character in D&D, in a definitive sort of sense there. Now, I thought that that was actually a pretty fitting end for that particular character, all in all, but at the same time, it always kind of sucks when player characters get killed off. So for a lot of DMs, I know that they sort of like killing off player characters for X, Y, or Z reason, but I really hate killing off player characters. I try to avoid it where possible, which is another reason why I've got lower level encounters against players. It means that even if I'm rolling well against like a party, it doesn't matter that I'm rolling well because I'm not doing as much damage. I don't use the really big abilities because lower level encounters generally can't, and so on and so forth. So they're likely to survive encounters in my campaigns because it really breaks up the dynamic in the story if your characters keep dying in a certain sense there, because I prefer the story to be about the characters and their personal development arcs rather than being about some sort of plot. A DM can foist a plot onto a player group, and it can be hit or miss. But if you really make it about the characters, I find that those are always the strongest sort of stories that a DM can sort of tell. So that's just my sort of perspective on that. And obviously that system doesn't really work very well if the player characters are dying on a fairly frequent basis, especially if they're dying to really inconsequential or stupid things. This ended up being a fairly long-running battle about the player's individual sort of hubris, or the individual character's hubris and greed. And so I think that this ended up being a fairly appropriate and thematic death for them in a very strong sense there. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about the other time that I've killed off a player character. Okay, so this is about the second story here, and this one takes place in a horror campaign. In my sort of particular group, I'm generally speaking going to be the one in our group that runs a hard psychological horror style campaign. And these are generally shorter, and they're really tricky to run. There's a lot of traits to a horror campaign that have to be very contrary to what you would normally see in a standard D&D campaign, because you're not running this for a group of heroes and you're really not doing it for a group of intrepid adventurers, at least in my opinion. There's another person in our group who will run Call of Cthulhu campaigns, but those usually end up being sort of hack and slashy kind of ones, because ultimately the books for the Call of Cthulhu RPG system aren't really very good at actually scaring players. It's more that you encounter monsters and have to deal with it with dice rolls rather than through roleplay. And I don't particularly like the system as a result of that, so I usually sort of leave the insanity mechanics as a more freeform thing with no mechanics to it. And as a result, usually the players are more willing to sort of be immersed in the world when they're not being told that they're going crazy or that they're being told that they're going insane. So anyway, this particular story takes place on the sort of small island between Ireland and London. The group is essentially traveling from Ireland to London after having committed some business there. They all just happen to be on that particular charter boat that goes between the two. It's a small one, and on the way, it's stopping off on this little island. Along with them is, of course, the person piloting the boat who owns the little steamship, as well as a detective and his assistant. So the detective and assistant are stopping by here, and they reveal the fact that this little island has had some mysterious disappearances and occurrences happening lately, so they've been sent to investigate. So the whole group ends up on the island. They got off the boat so that they can stretch their legs and so on and so forth. And also, the ship needs to coal back up again. This is taking place in the 1800s, so the ship runs on coal. So while they're sort of getting the buckets and loading it back up, or rather the attendant there is doing that, the rest of the group sort of is told that it'll be a day before they're actually ready to set off again. So they head over towards the estate where they're told that they can stay for the evening. And I'm the sort of person who doesn't really like DMPCs as well, so I generally don't run them. In this particular case, the detective and his assistant were simply sort of a red herring that were able to sort of reveal a little bit about the plot, that there's something going wrong here, and to lure the players onto the island, because they otherwise would have no real conceivable reason to be to this place, unless I had them be the investigators themselves, which in hindsight I probably should have done. This was one of my earlier campaigns, but it still worked out okay in the end as far as that goes. Now, as a secondary aside, this is a campaign... Excuse me, this is a campaign I never quite finished, and the reason is that I'm kind of the group's in between DM. So I typically run very short campaigns in between other more dedicated DMs. The exception was that previous story. There's been a couple longer running campaigns where there were a full narrative arc that I did from beginning to end and ran a satisfactory conclusion with. The previous story was actually one of those. Ran something like 5 months or something like that, and was a pretty good one. And this short horror campaign, though, was supposed to just be a quick filler between two DMs. One of the campaigns had finished. The next DM had a campaign idea, but it wasn't quite ready yet, so I was trying to fill in between that. So this never ended up being finished, but in the end, though, it still was what it was. Anyway, so the players get onto the island, and they're sort of milling about. And I was using the World of Darkness rules because that was what players had sort of said would potentially fit with this. In the end, I disagree with that, but it was what I ended up running just because they felt like playing it. The mechanics are fine, but it doesn't really add much to the situation. So our party consisted of 2 vampires and a normal old human. And the normal old human didn't know that the other 2 players were vampires. Now, one of the things that I think those other 2 were thinking was that by playing vampires, they wouldn't have to worry about all the horror things that were going to happen. And boy, did that ever not work out very well for them. Anyway, so they go onto the island, they get introduced to the Lord of the Manor, they get introduced to where they're going to be staying the night until whatever happens. And off goes the detective and their assistant. And some hours later, they manage to find out that the detective has gone missing, and a while after that his assistant gets killed in a way that they sort of are able to see. So at this point in time it becomes fairly obvious that the things aren't quite what they seem there. So they go back to the boat and find out that the water at this point in time has converted into some sort of mysterious acid, and the boat itself is being eaten and sinking. And the reason that you have to do this in a horror setting is that any horror setting has to be isolated from just walking away from the horror situation in some supernatural way, and this was the way that I did this. And if you don't do this in your story, there's always going to be this sort of like really strong feeling in the back of your head when you're playing the horror game or whatever of why don't I just walk away from this situation. And there's certain ways that you can make sure that the character has an intrinsic motivation to stay in the setting. Like Silent Hill does a very good job of this, and I think that Amnesia Machine for Pigs does a great job for this. Like there's realistically no reason that Mundus has to stay where he is, but he has a strong in-character motivation for staying where he is. Amnesia Daniel, I think, there's a much weaker reasoning for him staying around, and I feel like since he doesn't remember that what's going on or why, there's no reason he couldn't have just thrown like a knotted up carpet out one of the windows and gotten out of the castle that way. So, that kind of, and oh god, don't even get me started about like, I can't even remember what it's called right now. It's the one where you're in that stupid prison. But yeah, like that stupid reporter should not have been there. There's literally no reason why he should have stuck around for that. But anyway, generally speaking, like unless you want to dictate to your characters what their backstory and their character ideals are, which I really don't like doing, and I'd like there are certain times where I think it would be necessary to say, okay, you have to play a character who does this sort of thing, and who would react to this situation by doing this, and you can just make that a mandate of the game, and like. That's fine, but I don't particularly like doing that since it sort of takes away a little bit of that player agency there. But if it's for a horror campaign, that might be what you have to do. The other alternative is you simply put up a physical barrier of some sort that makes it impossible for them to leave that area or that situation. And so that's sort of what that ocean of acid is for. There's also an in-game justification for it, but really it's just a justification for something that I was going to be doing and have to do anyway. And the reason that you have to put this up is demonstrated like further in when the players decide that the island is too haunted for them to stay on, and they all decide that they really, really need to leave. So there's a whole bunch of things that happen throughout this sort of thing, and the players are doing their best to sort of get through it. One player is kind of investigating, trying to figure out what he can do to sort of stop this to a certain degree. One of them is sort of trying to figure out a way to stay safe throughout it, and another one is sort of just like freaking out to a large extent. Which I thought was pretty great. Eventually they find something like an elder sign, and I simply described it as being one since it was an easy reference that they understood, and it sort of quickly conveyed what it was for and so on and so forth. Supernatural beings couldn't approach these things within a certain radius, and it kept you safe to a certain degree from those kinds of things. And one of the interesting things was this meant the two vampire players couldn't approach this at all, like not even a little bit. So the one player who is able to sort of take this sort of stuff does actually bring it with him. It's engraved into a very old book. I can't remember actually what I had the book be about, but anyway, he's got that copy of it. He's got it with him, and he's using it sort of keep safe as best as he can. But at a certain point in time, the house starts sprouting eyes, and eyes is actually one of the big recurring motifs of the horror campaign. I think that a lot of horror campaigns, you'll typically see something recurring in terms of what it is that is trying to scare the players. In my particular case, I liked using eyes just because I think that they're kind of freaky. It's the kind of one where like you're being stared at constantly. One of my favorite scares actually that I was running in this was one of the players was trapped in the cellar. So eventually he takes out his gun and fires at the wood there and breaks a hole through the plank. And it's still dark. He still can't see anything. There's no light streaming in through the hole that he just made. So he flashes his flashlight up. Well, actually, no. I think he was using a lamp. So he uses his lamp to sort of see what's up there. And through the hole that he shot in there, he can just see this one bloodshot eye staring down at him through the hole. So he fires away again at the eye, and it starts leaking this black acidic blood down on him. And it leaves, and it turns out that he couldn't open the thing because there's the weight of a body sort of resting against the wood. So that was kind of an interesting encounter in a sense there. But anyway, so yeah, the house starts sprouting eyes and so on and so forth, and they're sort of like staring at the player characters, and like they aren't doing anything. The eyes aren't really doing anything. They're not malicious. They're just all watching as though something larger than them was viewing what they were doing. And one of the other things that was happening by this point in time was that the trees were sort of turning from being made out of wood to sort of fleshy ones made out of limbs and arms and so on and so forth. And like the players had been for a while at that point in time trying to assemble a raft to get off the island, and they'd been sort of lopping off branches and so on and so forth, and those were still fine. Like those were still okay. The problem was that they couldn't finish the raft with the amount of branches that they had at this point in time, so they had to finish the raft with arms that they had lopped off of the trees. So these were like literally arms with these very freakish fingers sort of jutting out at obscure angles with too many joints and so on and so forth. So they lashed a whole ton of these together, and they've eventually got their raft. And the player character who's got the elder sign sort of straps that to the top of the boat to try and stop the whole thing from being attacked by things along the way, and maybe hopefully protecting against that acid because he figures it might be supernatural in origin. So in any event, as you might have noticed, this means that the two vampires can't get onto the boat at this point in time. So he shoves off, and he's like, "Why are you two not getting on the raft?" And they're just sort of, they're not going to say it's because we're vampires and we can't go near that elder sign. And so he's just sort of like, "Oh, okay." He just sort of puts two and two together and figures that they must be some sort of bad news, and sets off into the wild blue yonder on his raft made out of arms into the ocean of acid. And at that point in time, I reveal that, yeah, indeed, the boat is actually starting to dissolve. It is not immune to the acid. And so, his character, now that he's about 100 meters away from shore, just decides to just off himself at this point, which, is pretty reasonable. He was screwed regardless, but, it was one of those sort of situations there. And yeah, that could definitely be construed as the first time I caused a player character death in one of my campaigns. I definitely don't feel as responsible for this one because, he literally decided to off himself to get out of the situation that he was in, and I didn't put him in the situation, so definitely not really my fault there, in my opinion. Now, one of the things to note about my party in a certain sense there is that it's a bit perverse for me to be running any sort of horror campaigns for them as a group regardless, because two of them literally functionally cannot play horror games like video games or like even watch horror movies. And The other player was actually doing kind of okay, but like for two of them, he just literally cannot play those games. There's another player actually in our group who wasn't in that campaign who sort of fits in that same boat. They just don't handle horror, I think, very well. So it's kind of sadistic for me to do that, but I really like horror campaigns and I really like horror games and stuff like that. So difficult for me to not from time to time run those, but yeah, that's definitely one of those sort of moments there. So anyway, that's my two stories about player character deaths in my campaigns. They're very few and far between. I definitely prefer campaigns where the odds of a player character dying is low. But yeah, I hope you found this video enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.